Please be aware, in this podcast series we talk about all areas of safeguarding, which some people may find upsetting. So please make sure you're okay listening to today's topic. Be mindful of those around you, such as children, that you might not want to listen in. Hi, I'm SSS Safeguarding Director Sam Preston.
And I'm former head teacher and content author Sara Spinks.
Welcome back to Safeguarding Conversations. Today we're talking about something that sits right at the centre of safeguarding practice, but is often one of the hardest forms of harm to recognise: emotional abuse.
Yeah, and this topic came up for me recently, actually, in a conversation with a friend. He told me that he'd actually worked as a social worker for about 10 years, something I didn't know about him, actually. And when I asked why he'd left the profession, he said it was because emotional abuse was just so difficult to prove.
Oh, gosh, Sarah, that must have been hard to hear.
Yeah, it really was, and he said it really affected him because he could see the harm children were experiencing, but demonstrating that harm in a way that led to intervention wasn't always straightforward. And over time, it just really took a toll on his mental health.
And that reflects a wider challenge in safeguarding, doesn't it? So when people hear the term child abuse, they imagine those visible injuries, bruises, broken bones, or something very obviously wrong.
Exactly. But I think, emotional abuse is often far less visible. It rarely leaves physical marks. But instead, it gradually affects how a child sees themselves, how they understand relationships, and, how they manage their emotions. And it can involve sort of repeated criticism, humiliation, or intimidation. But it can also be more subtle than that. Sometimes it's about what children don't receive rather than what they do. A sort of lack of emotional support, warmth, or responsiveness from the adults around them.
So let's talk a little bit more, Sarah, about what, emotional abuse actually looks like then.
Well, emotional abuse occurs when a child's emotional development or sense of identity is repeatedly undermined. So that might, as I've said before, involve humiliation or rejection, intimidation, scapegoating, or constant criticism.
And it can also happen when adults place expectations on children that are simply inappropriate for their age.
Absolutely. So, for example, expecting a child to take responsibility for managing adult emotions or placing them in roles that are far beyond their developmental stage.
Another important aspect is exposure to domestic abuse or coercive control between adults. So even if a child is not directly physically harmed, growing up in an environment where coercive control or domestic abuse is present can still constitute emotional abuse because of the psychological impact on the child. They are a victim. And one of the key challenges is that emotional abuse often develops through patterns of behaviour over time rather than through a single incident.
Absolutely, which is why it can be even harder to identify.
And when we look at the research, emotional abuse is far more common than many people think.
Absolutely. Research by Heather L. Dye in 2019 suggests that emotional abuse and emotional neglect are amongst the most prevalent forms of childhood maltreatment and can have significant long-term mental health consequences.
And UK statistics, they show how widespread the issue is. The NSPCC reported last year around 1 in 15 young people aged between 11 and 17. They say they have experienced emotional abuse during childhood. Also, there's a systematic review by Jenkins and Bryant that looked at violence against children in the UK. They found similar patterns, with emotional maltreatment appearing in around 11, nearly 12% of self-reported experiences of childhood abuse. And I'd hazard to say that that's self-reported.
Yeah, I agree.
It's a very conservative figure.
Yeah. And what's also interesting, I think, is that public awareness doesn't always translate into recognition. That, another survey by the NSPCC found that 94% of adults believe emotional abuse can have a lasting psychological effects, but around 1 in 6 adults say they would struggle to identify examples of it.
Yeah.
So we have this situation where people recognize the seriousness of emotional abuse, but identifying it in practice remains challenging.
And this is where schools have such an important role because emotional abuse often happens in private settings. Schools may be one of the few places where early signs begin to appear. Teachers and school staff might notice changes in behaviour or emotional well-being before anyone else.
Yeah, and children experiencing emotional abuse may show low self esteem, persistent anxiety, or withdrawal from social interactions, for example, whereas others might struggle with friendships or appear overly sensitive to criticism or show difficulties regulating emotions. Sometimes the signs are subtle, perhaps a gradual decline in engagement with learning or increased risk taking behaviour.
And research suggests that emotional maltreatment can also affect brain development and stress responses. So the impact can be long term because emotional abuse influences how children manage their emotions and their relationships. So let's take a look, Sarah. What can schools do to respond effectively?
Well, I think one of the most important factors is building trusted relationships between pupils and staff. We say this a lot. I mean, as a teacher, cut the head off me and it'll say relationships all the way through me like a stick of rock. When children feel listened to and respected, they are far more likely to share their concerns.
I think staff training, I mean, I'm bound to say this, Anita, but staff
Yeah.
training is also essential so that teachers, support staff, and governors understand the different ways emotional abuse might present. And obviously, safeguarding policies should also clearly reference emotional abuse so that concerns are addressed even when physical signs are absent. And schools can also support emotional well-being through programs that help children understand and regulate their emotions.
Yeah, things like PSHE lessons, or mentoring programs or wellbeing initiatives, they really can help pupils develop the resilience and healthy coping strategies.
And also working constructively with parents and carers, that can also help strengthen children's emotional environments.
I think there's some really important things schools should avoid when responding to emotional harm. One is dismissing emotional distress as simply, for example, typical teenage behavior,
Yeah.
And I think another one is make an assumption that pupils who appear well behaved or, or academically successful are completely unaffected by emotional harm. I think that's really important.
Yeah, such an important point, Sarah, because some children experiencing emotional abuse may feel intense pressure to perform well.
Yeah.
And waiting for a crisis before responding can also be problematic. Emotional abuse is often cumulative, so harm may already be significant by the time dramatic incidents occur, if they do occur. And perhaps, a useful reflection for safeguarding leads is to think about the pupils who may not attract attention.
Absolutely. We've talked about this when we've talked about masking as well, haven't we, Sam?
Yeah,
Those children who are consistently quiet,
yeah.
withdrawn, or emotionally disengaged, because those pupils may not disrupt lessons or raise concerns in really obvious ways, but they're still experiencing significant emotional distress.
I think, creating those spaces where children feel safe to talk is crucial. It's a crucial part of safeguarding practice. Emotional abuse may be invisible in the moment, but in its impact, it can be long lasting. It
It's
can
an
shape,
ACEs, isn't it? It's an
it
adverse
is,
childhood experience.
it
Yeah.
totally is. And it can shape a child's view of their self image, influence their mental health and well being, and affect their future relationships.
Absolutely. So I think what's really important is that schools, therefore, they play a vital role in recognizing early signs and creating environments where emotional well-being is prioritized. Because safeguarding isn't only about protecting children from physical harm, it's also about ensuring every child feels safe, valued, and supported.
Absolutely. Well, if you would like more information on this, please visit our website where we also have training on supporting the mental health and well-being of children. Thanks for listening and look forward to seeing you next time.